Western Europe, late summer, 1944. The smell of burned steel still lingers across the French countryside. On the edge of a ruined village, a German panzer commander peers through his binoculars, expecting silence after weeks of relentless fighting. His armored column lies shattered behind him, tracks blown off, hulls smoldering. But through the rising heat waves on the distant road, he sees movement, a line of tanks. Dozens at first, then hundreds. Endless rows of olive-green machines, Shermans, half-tracks, trucks, rolling forward as if they'd never been touched by war. The commander lowers his glasses, his expression hollow. His regiment had destroyed wave after wave of these machines only days before. Yet here they were again, replaced faster than his mind could comprehend. He murmurs quietly to his adjutant, "If they can replace all that in a week, how can we ever win?" Across the front, reports echoed the same disbelief. German intelligence officers, poring over field data, couldn't understand it. Factories bombed, ships sunk, divisions lost, and yet the Americans kept coming. The war was no longer just a contest of armies. It had become a war of machines, and America's factories were its greatest weapon. Before the first American soldier ever set foot in Europe, the outcome of World War II was already being decided not only in the skies over France or the deserts of North Africa, but deep within the factories, shipyards, and steel mills of two very different nations. When Adolf Hitler launched his invasion of Poland in September 1939, Germany's military machine appeared unstoppable. Its armored spearheads, Panzer IIs, IIIs, and IVs, rolled with speed and precision. Its Luftwaffe dominated the skies. Blitzkrieg looked invincible. But behind that spectacle was a fragile truth. Germany's industrial base was never built for a long war. Before the conflict, German factories were already strained. The Nazi regime had rearmed in defiance of the Versailles Treaty, but it did so through a patchwork of overworked plants, limited steel supplies, and a dependence on synthetic oil. By 1940, the Reich was already short on raw materials. The conquest of Europe gave it territory, not efficiency. Each captured factory had different machinery, gauges, and standards. A logistical nightmare. Even at its peak in 1944, German industry produced around 19,000 tanks. An impressive number, but one achieved through desperation. Factories ran under constant bombing, with slave laborers, erratic supply lines, and a collapsing transport network. Across the Atlantic, a very different story was unfolding. When war erupted, the United States possessed no standing army of real size. But it had something more powerful: industrial capacity without limit. By 1939, American factories had mastered large-scale automobile production. Henry Ford's assembly lines, perfected in Detroit, could produce thousands of cars per day. And that same logic of mass production would soon be applied to war. Germany built tanks by hand, each one slightly different. America built them like cars. Standardized, interchangeable, efficient. The gap was staggering. In 1940, the entire German economy produced about 15 million tons of steel. The United States produced nearly 48 million. And when the American government decided to mobilize, it did so with a scale of planning unseen in history. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's Arsenal of Democracy speech in December 1940 was more than a promise. It was a declaration of transformation. He told the nation that America would build ships, planes, tanks, and guns to defend freedom worldwide. And then it did. Factories that once made typewriters, refrigerators, and cars were converted overnight. General Motors built tanks. Ford produced B-24 O-24 bombers. Chrysler assembled entire tank divisions. Women filled the factories, symbolized by the now iconic figure of Rosie the Riveter. To Germany's high command, this seemed impossible. By 1941, While Hitler was launching Operation Barbarossa into the Soviet Union, the Americans, still technically neutral, were already producing more weapons per month than the Axis combined. German intelligence estimated that U.S. production would collapse under resource shortages or workforce inexperience. It never did. Instead, the efficiency only grew. By 1942, American assembly lines were operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Every minute, a new rifle. Every hour, new trucks. Every few minutes, another tank. To the German war planners, this pace defied logic. Their factories were protected by secrecy and state propaganda, but in America, newspapers openly published photos of sprawling production plants. They called them victory factories. The psychological divide was already forming. Germany was fighting for survival. America was only getting started. As 1942 turned to 1943, that imbalance began to reshape the battlefield itself. American production wasn't just about quantity. It was about momentum. And for the men on the front lines, the first signs of that momentum were already rolling off the ships into North Africa. By early 1943, the full weight of the American war machine had awakened. And once it did, it moved like nothing the world had ever seen. From Detroit to Pittsburgh, Los Angeles to Chicago, an industrial storm surged across the nation. Smokestacks glowed red into the night, railways thundered with freight, and shipyards turned out new vessels at a pace that defied imagination. What Roosevelt had promised in his Arsenal of Democracy speech was no longer rhetoric. It had become a living, breathing force. The transformation was total. Civilian production was halted or retooled. The last automobile rolled off the line in February 1942. From that moment, every factory focused on war. Ford's Willow Run plant, for instance, stretched over a mile long, the largest factory under one roof in the world, and was capable of producing one B-24 Liberator bomber every hour. Nearby, General Motors manufactured tanks and aircraft engines. While Chrysler's Detroit arsenal churned out thousands of Sherman tanks, each rolling off the line in a precisely timed rhythm. The same techniques that had revolutionized the car industry now reshaped warfare. Itself, America's weapon was standardization. Every Sherman tank used interchangeable parts, a concept the Germans never mastered. Crews could swap engines or treads in the field. Factories across multiple states could produce identical components without variation. This single principle allowed production to surge beyond comprehension. And it wasn't just tanks. By 1944, American factories had produced more than 86,000 tanks, 300,000 aircraft, and 2.6 million military trucks. The numbers alone seemed unreal. But for German commanders on the ground, those numbers translated into a terrifying reality. No matter how many Allied machines they destroyed, replacements arrived almost instantly. This miracle of output was powered by human determination. Millions of American civilians, men and women, black and white, immigrant and native-born, became part of one vast workforce. More than 6 million women entered the factories, working 12-hour shifts, welding steel, riveting armor, and assembling engines. Posters called them soldiers of production. The U.S. government coordinated everything through new agencies like the War Production Board, ensuring that raw materials, transport, and labor moved like clockwork. Rubber from Brazil, oil from Texas, and steel from Pennsylvania all flowed into a national bloodstream of production. Even Hollywood joined the cause, producing films, posters, and broadcasts to inspire efficiency. A worker who saved time was saving lives. A factory that broke its output record became front-page news, and across the ocean, Axis intelligence watched in disbelief. German spies and diplomats sent frantic reports back to Berlin describing the scale of American industry. They reported on factories running 24 hours a day, with floodlights illuminating entire cities. One report, later captured by Allied forces, concluded grimly, "America is fighting a war of machines, and machines cannot be bombed into submission." By 1943, the arsenal of democracy was no longer just supplying American troops. It was supplying the world. Thousands of ships crossed the Atlantic every month, carrying tanks, jeeps, aircraft, and ammunition to Britain, the Soviet Union, and China. Under the Lend-Lease program, entire armies were re-equipped with American hardware. In Berlin, Joseph Goebbels tried to counter this with propaganda, claiming that mass production meant poor quality. But by 1944, those words rang hollow. The Allies' inferior machines were everywhere, from the deserts of Tunisia to the beaches of Normandy. And they kept coming. Germany's factories, under constant bombing and running on forced labor, could no longer compete. Its tank production struggled to reach even a fraction of the American total. The Reich could build a Tiger or a Panther, masterpieces of engineering, but America could build 50 Shermans in the same time. And while the German army began rationing fuel and ammunition, the Americans had so much equipment they could leave entire vehicles behind rather than repair them. By mid-1944, the tide of war was no longer turning. It had already turned. The Allied advance across Europe was being driven not only by strategy or courage, but by the unstoppable rhythm of factories 10,000 kilometers away. The men on the ground could feel it. Every convoy that landed, every replacement tank that arrived within days of battle. All were living proof that this war would be decided not by genius, but by output. And it was here, in the fires of 1944, that German soldiers began to understand. They were not only fighting the U.S. Army, they were fighting American industry itself. To understand how the United States replaced 10,000 tanks in what seemed like a single month, one must look beyond steel and rivets to the system that made it possible. The miracle wasn't magic. It was design, discipline, and the sheer force of collective effort. The technological foundation of this machine lay in mass production and logistics. Every American tank, truck, or aircraft was part of a greater system, a web of standardized parts, modular design, and transportation efficiency that allowed production to scale beyond imagination. Factories didn't work in isolation. One plant forged the armor plating, another built engines, another produced guns or optics, and each of these was connected by rail, road, and river in an industrial choreography that ran with near-perfect synchronization. This wasn't just manufacturing, it was a form of warfare. The Quartermaster Corps, Ordnance Department, and Transportation Command acted as military equivalents of corporate managers. By 1943, the U.S. Army operated more than 1,500 depots across the world, storing everything from rations to replacement engines. A tank destroyed in France could be replaced with one built in Michigan, shipped from New York, and unloaded at Cherbourg within weeks. Every bolt and bracket had a serial number and a purpose. In German factories, skilled craftsmen meticulously hand-fitted parts for each tank, a process that produced quality but consumed precious time. In American factories, machines stamped thousands of identical components per hour. The result wasn't elegance, it was speed, and speed in this war was survival. By the time the U.S. entered full combat in Europe, logistical planning had become an art form. The Red Ball Express, a vast convoy network operated largely by African-American drivers, moved over 12,000 tons of supplies per day through the shattered roads of France. Fuel, shells, food, and spare parts all flowed forward like a living artery. Meanwhile, the home front pulsed with its own rhythm. Millions of ordinary Americans, many of whom had never seen a battlefield, became the silent soldiers of production. Housewives learned to operate lathes. Farmers' daughters welded armor plating. College students assembled radios and torpedo parts. Immigrants, who had arrived seeking opportunity, found themselves building the very machines that would defend it. Posters reminded them daily, "The man behind the gun depends on you." For many, this was more than duty. It was pride, the sense that every rivet tightened, every engine tested, might one day save a life on the front lines. That consciousness turned assembly lines into battlefields of their own. Among the most remarkable contributors were women. By 1944, nearly one-third of the entire industrial workforce was female. Rosie the Riveter became the symbol of national resilience. Sleeves rolled up, gaze steady, declaring, "We can do it." For many, it was the first time they had earned wages or worked outside the home. The war gave them both independence and purpose, and America's factories thrived because of it. In contrast, Germany relied heavily on forced labor, prisoners of war, civilians from occupied territories, and concentration camp inmates. These workers labored under brutality, malnutrition, and fear, producing weapons for a cause they despised. The contrast in morale could not have been starker. In America, workers built from belief. In Germany, they built from coercion. Technology also favored the Americans. The U.S. industrial base was electrified, mechanized, and integrated into a continental infrastructure. Automated machine tools, standardized gauges, and conveyor-driven assembly lines eliminated bottlenecks that crippled other nations. It wasn't that every American tank was superior. It was that there were always more of them. Where the Germans aimed for perfection, America aimed for efficiency. The M4 Sherman might not match the firepower of a Panther, but it could be produced 5 times faster, repaired anywhere, and replaced endlessly. And when paired with air superiority and fuel abundance, it became unstoppable. Behind every one of those tanks stood thousands of workers, faces blackened by smoke, hands hardened by steel, each one unknowingly shaping the outcome of the war. To the world outside, this looked like cold mechanical efficiency, but within those factories, it felt human, driven by families, communities, and the belief that their labor would protect someone's son, brother, or husband overseas. By 1944, the American industrial base had reached a level of output so vast that even its leaders struggled to comprehend it. Shipyards launched a new Liberty ship every 2 days. Aircraft factories produced more planes than pilots could be trained to fly. And when reports of this reached German high command, disbelief turned into dread. For if this was only 1 year's output, what would the next bring? Inside Germany, by 1944, a deep unease was spreading through the ranks of officers and ministers. The myth of the Thousand-Year Reich was fading, not because of battlefield defeat alone, but because of something far more chilling: the realization that they were fighting a nation whose factories could fight harder than their armies. German intelligence units had been monitoring Allied production for years. Early in the war, reports about American industry were often dismissed as exaggerations or propaganda. Many within the German high command believed that democratic nations lacked the discipline for total war. They thought capitalism would collapse under strain. But by 1943, as reports from the Eastern Front and North Africa poured in, the numbers could no longer be denied. Field commanders wrote that destroyed U.S. tanks reappeared on the battlefield within days. Luftwaffe reconnaissance photos showed endless rows of vehicles lined up at Allied ports. Prisoners of war spoke of American convoys stretching from horizon to horizon. In Berlin, Joseph Goebbels, the master of Nazi propaganda, faced an impossible task: maintaining the illusion of German superiority while confronting an enemy that could seemingly conjure weapons. Out of thin air, his radio speeches mocked American production as quantity without quality, sneering that Allied tanks were rolling coffins and that mass production was a poor substitute for genius. Yet privately, his diary told another story. In 1944, he wrote, The Americans seem to have an inexhaustible supply of materiel. Their factories are producing even faster than we destroy. It is madness. This madness was spreading among German officers as well. After the collapse of the Afrika Korps in 1943, captured German generals admitted under interrogation that their primary defeat was logistical, not tactical. One remarked bitterly, "We fought the Americans once. Then they came back the next day with twice as many tanks." For Hitler, the realization came too late, and his response revealed the fatal flaw of his leadership. Instead of adapting, he demanded perfection. Where Roosevelt delegated authority to businessmen, engineers, and military planners, Hitler micromanaged every detail. He demanded new miracle weapons, the Tiger, King Tiger, Me-262, and V weapons, all magnificent but time-consuming. Each new design required unique parts, specialized labor, and months of development. Meanwhile, Roosevelt's administration favored practical efficiency over brilliance. He empowered men like William Knudsen, the former president of General Motors, to oversee military production. Knudsen's philosophy was simple. The best is the enemy of the good. Better to build thousands of reliable machines than a handful of masterpieces. That difference in philosophy, pragmatism versus perfectionism, defined the war's industrial front. As the Allies prepared for the D-Day invasion in 1944, German intelligence analysts compiled estimates of Allied armor and vehicle strength. Their figures, even when conservative, were terrifying. They reported over 40,000 tanks and armored vehicles, massed for the invasion, with more arriving daily. Goebbels's ministry tried to spin the data, assuring the public that Germany's superior technology would prevail. But the Wehrmacht's frontline soldiers saw the truth with their own eyes. During the Battle of Normandy, German panzer crews destroyed hundreds of Allied tanks. Yet the fields behind the front lines kept filling with replacements. Convoys of new Shermans rolled ashore faster than German units could recover. The illusion of balance was shattered. Officers wrote home in despair. They have more tanks now than before the battle began. How can this be? The answer lay not in magic, but in logistics. The Americans had turned warfare into an industrial process. Roosevelt's leadership style had unlocked the full potential of the nation. He trusted his engineers, his generals, and his labor force. He inspired them with vision, not fear. Where Hitler ruled by command, Roosevelt ruled by coordination. While German factories ran on punishment and propaganda, American factories ran on competition and pride. Workers earned bonuses for exceeding quotas. Engineers innovated to save time and materials. Every citizen could see their contribution adding up, in tanks, ships, and victory posters. By the end of 1944, German officers who captured Allied equipment or supply dumps were stunned by the excess. Mountains of spare parts, crates of ammunition, even unopened tanks waiting to be deployed. One officer wrote in disbelief, "They have so much material, they throw it away. We cannot even fuel what we have." To many Germans, this realization was the moment hope truly died. They had entered the war believing in destiny, in willpower, in the superiority of German science and precision. But standing against them was an empire of industry that turned out more machines in a month than Germany could in a year. It was not just the battlefield that was lost, it was the very foundation of their belief in technological supremacy. And as the year closed, that belief would crumble completely. On the frozen battlefields of the Ardennes, where American industry would prove its strength in the harshest test of all. December 16, 1944. The forests of the Ardennes lay silent beneath a thick coat of snow. Then, thunder. The last great German offensive of the war had begun. Operation Watch on the Rhine, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge, was Adolf Hitler's final desperate attempt to split the Allied lines and force a negotiated peace. Over 200,000 German troops and nearly 1,000 tanks surged into Belgium and Luxembourg, catching the Allies completely off guard. For a moment, it worked. The fog, the snow, and the element of surprise gave the Germans their final flash of tactical brilliance. American divisions, exhausted and scattered, were driven back. Entire regiments were encircled. Fuel convoys were ambushed and destroyed. To many observers, it seemed as though the Germans had found one last surge of strength. But beneath the surface, this offensive revealed something much deeper: the collapse of Germany's ability to sustain war. The offensive had been built on illusion. Hitler had scraped together the last reserves of fuel, men, and armor. His tanks rolled with barely enough fuel to reach their objectives. Factories had been bombed to ruins. Supply lines barely functioned. Yet, in a final act of defiance, Germany threw everything it had left into the snow. For the Americans, the shock was immense, but temporary. Within days, Allied logistics swung into motion. Trains, trucks, and ships poured replacements into the front. Divisions that had been devastated one week were reinforced the next. In some cases, units received new tanks before the old wrecks were even cleared from the battlefield. This was the true revelation of American power. While German divisions fought, with dwindling fuel and ammunition, American soldiers were backed by an industrial tide that seemed limitless. The U.S. Army moved more than 90,000 tons of supplies per day to the European front, an amount beyond anything the German High Command could imagine. When the 2nd Panzer Division reached the outskirts of Dinant, Belgium, it ran out of fuel. Its tanks sat frozen, not by winter, but by exhaustion. The men waited for supplies that never came. Meanwhile, Allied aircraft, built by the thousands in American factories, returned to the skies as soon as the weather cleared, shredding columns of stalled armor. Each destroyed German tank represented months of irreplaceable work. Each destroyed American tank was replaced within days. For the German officers commanding the offensive, the realization was devastating. They could win tactical victories, destroy entire enemy battalions, and yet lose the war anyway. Because across the Atlantic, factories in Detroit, Chicago, and Los Angeles were already rebuilding everything they had just destroyed. The Battle of the Bulge was not just a military clash, it was the visible proof of industrial imbalance. In January 1945, as the offensive collapsed, German field reports described American replacement patterns with disbelief. One Wehrmacht colonel wrote, "We destroyed more tanks in 1 week than our factories can build in 3 months. Yet the enemy is stronger than before." The contrast was absolute. The Germans had produced roughly 6,000 tanks in 1944, many of them crippled by shortages and design flaws. The Americans produced over 29,000 that same year. Every rail car, every assembly line, every factory worker in the United States was now part of the war effort. And by late 1944, their collective rhythm was unstoppable. Even as the Ardennes forests burned, thousands of new Shermans were being shipped out from the Detroit arsenal. Liberty ships left New York Harbor daily, each loaded with hundreds of vehicles. Within weeks, the Allied losses from the Bulge were fully replaced, an industrial resurrection that stunned the German intelligence services. American soldiers noticed it too. In their letters home, many described an almost surreal sense of abundance. Spare parts everywhere, food rations overflowing, new uniforms and vehicles waiting at every depot. They began to call their supply network the pipeline, and it never ran dry. To the Germans watching from the other side of the front, it felt like fighting a machine that couldn't be broken. Even when they destroyed columns of American armor, new ones appeared behind them, like waves against a fortress. One Panzer officer later recalled in post-war interviews, "We thought we were fighting men. Then we realized we were fighting their factories." By mid-January 1945, the offensive had collapsed completely. What had begun as Hitler's final bid for victory had become a crushing demonstration of Allied superiority. The Wehrmacht was left broken, its last reserves spent, its fuel gone, its tanks smoldering in the snow. Meanwhile, in the factories thousands of miles away, the assembly lines never stopped. More tanks, more trucks, more planes. The arsenal of democracy was not just producing weapons, it was producing inevitability. And as German commanders surveyed their ruined divisions, one truth became clear. America had not merely outfought them, it had outproduced them. By February 1945, the snow of the Ardennes was melting into mud, and with it, melted the last illusions within the German High Command. The Battle of the Bulge had not just been a military defeat, it had exposed a truth that stunned even the most hardened officers. The war had become unwinnable, because the enemy's factories had become a weapon beyond reach. Captured documents, intelligence summaries, and intercepted communications began painting a terrifying picture. What German officers had suspected for months was now confirmed. America's wartime output was not just large. It was mathematically unstoppable. Reports compiled by the Wehrwirtschaftsstab, Germany's economic warfare office, revealed production statistics that defied comprehension. By late 1944, American industry had produced more than 88,000 tanks, 325,000 aircraft, and over 2.4 million trucks. The numbers kept climbing every month. When German analysts compared these figures to their own, the result bordered on disbelief. In that same period, the entire German war economy, even after full mobilization under Albert Speer, had managed barely 1/5 of those totals. One captured intelligence officer, interrogated by Allied forces after the war, recalled, "We could calculate that they were making more than we could destroy, but we could not accept it emotionally. It was too vast." Inside Germany, even Speer himself, the architect of the Reich's armaments miracle, began to grasp the hopelessness. He had streamlined production, doubled output, and delayed collapse for 2 years. Yet even at its peak, Germany's total tank output for 1944 was surpassed by America's monthly production capacity. Every time Allied bombing raids struck a factory, America built 2 more. Every time a division was wiped out in battle, replacements were already crossing the Atlantic. It was during the final months of the war that captured American supply depots left the deepest impression on German troops. In the ruins of France and Belgium, Wehrmacht soldiers stumbled upon stockpiles so immense they seemed surreal. Mountains of ammunition, spare engines stacked like crates of fruit, fuel drums stretching for miles. In one captured American logistics report, they found that a single U.S. armored division had more vehicles than an entire German Army Corps. A German officer inspecting a captured Red Ball Express convoy noted bitterly, "Their supply system is like a moving city. It eats and grows and never sleeps." Even Goebbels, still attempting to rally the population, privately admitted the futility. His diaries from March 1945 contain a haunting line. "The enemy's factories are fighting against us with the energy of a continent. We cannot strike them. They are invulnerable." Frontline soldiers saw the consequences firsthand. During the Allied push into Germany, the 3rd Armored Division alone replaced over 600 vehicles in a single month, a number equivalent to half of Germany's entire armored output at that point. To the average German tanker or infantryman, this was incomprehensible. They destroyed what they could, fought where they must, but deep inside they knew the enemy would always come back stronger. And it wasn't just tanks. The skies themselves testified to industrial supremacy. By early 1945, The U.S. Army Air Forces had so many aircraft that they could lose hundreds in a single day, and still maintain constant operations. Germany's jet-powered Me-262 fighters, though technically superior, could not tip the balance. They lacked fuel, spare parts, and trained pilots. America had all three, in endless supply. When the Allies crossed the Rhine in March 1945, the flow of equipment became so overwhelming that German observers compared it to a physical flood. Entire pontoon bridges were built overnight. Truck convoys stretched for 60 miles. New divisions appeared seemingly from nowhere. One Wehrmacht general, captured near the Ruhr, confessed to his American interrogators, "We used to measure time in days and weeks. You measure it in production cycles." It was a statement that summarized the war's transformation. For Germany, victory had once meant seizing territory or destroying armies. For America, victory was achieved by manufacturing faster than the enemy could comprehend. The factory floor had become the true front line. When Allied troops finally entered German cities, they discovered hidden industrial bunkers, silent, half-built tanks, unfinished V-weapons, the remains of a once proud industrial empire crushed under its own limitations. The dream of the Thousand-Year Reich had been undone not only by bullets and bombs, but by blueprints and assembly lines. The shock of America's scale lingered long after the war ended. Many German officers later reflected that they had underestimated the United States completely. They had seen it as a nation of consumers, not producers, a people too comfortable for total war. Yet when called upon, those same people had mobilized faster, harder, and longer than any nation in history. As the last of the Reich fell in April 1945, the contrast was complete. Germany's factories lay in ruins. America's were already shifting to peacetime production, stronger, richer, and untouched. The men who once believed in German invincibility now watched as endless columns of American armor rolled through their cities, each vehicle a reminder that they had not been defeated by one army, but by a nation that had turned industry into a weapon of war. And in their silence, one realization echoed through every surviving officer and worker alike. Germany had built its weapons to win battles. America had built its factories to win the war. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the world turned its eyes toward the staggering wreckage of the most industrialized war in human history. And within that silence, one truth stood above all others. The war had not only been fought on battlefields, but in factories. For Germany, the collapse was total. Entire cities had been ground into dust. Essen, Cologne, Hamburg, Dresden, all once engines of the Reich's industrial might. The Ruhr Valley, once the beating heart of German steel, now lay smoldering under Allied occupation. Machinery lay twisted, rail yards shattered, and workers displaced. When Allied investigators entered the remains of German plants, they found factories half-finished, production lines destroyed by bombing, and warehouses filled with incomplete weapons. The grand vision of total war that Joseph Goebbels had promised in 1943 had ended in paralysis. The statistics told a story of sheer imbalance. Between 1942 and 1945, Germany had produced roughly 46,000 tanks, over 110,000 aircraft, and 27,000 artillery pieces. The United States, during that same period, had produced over 88,000 tanks, 324,000 aircraft, and 372,000 artillery pieces, all while supplying Britain, the Soviet Union, and Free France. But production numbers alone did not tell the full story. The true difference lay in how those numbers were achieved. Where German factories relied on forced labor, manual assembly, and a shrinking resource base, American plants ran on automation, standardized design, and logistical genius. The Ford River Rouge complex in Michigan produced a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes by 1944. The Detroit Arsenal tank plant rolled out more. tanks per month than all of Germany's Panzer factories combined. And across the nation, from California to Pennsylvania, shipyards worked day and night to launch Liberty ships, faster than U-boats could sink them. These ships became lifelines, carrying food, oil, trucks, and weapons to every front. In 1943 alone, 2,110 Liberty ships were completed. One of them, the Robert E. Peary, was famously built in just 4 days and 15 hours. Such feats were inconceivable to German planners who, even at their most efficient, took weeks to finish a single Tiger tank. Post-war interviews with German industrial experts revealed their astonishment. Many admitted they had underestimated the Americans' ability to adapt civilian industry into military production. Dr. Fritz Todt, the engineer who once led Germany's armament efforts before his death in 1942, had warned Hitler that fighting an industrial war against the United States was suicide. "They will outbuild us 10-1, he said. His warning proved prophetic. By the end of 1945, America's industrial supremacy had reshaped the global balance of power. Europe lay in ruins, the Soviet Union exhausted, but the United States, untouched at home, stood as the only nation capable of supplying the world. Its factories, no longer needed for war, now poured their energy into consumer goods and reconstruction materials. The same assembly lines that once produced Shermans and Liberators now built cars, refrigerators, and tractors. Meanwhile, in Germany, hunger and cold replaced ambition. The industrial workers who had once forged Panzer armor now scavenged for food in the ruins of their own factories. Allied occupation authorities dismantled much of what remained of German heavy industry, repurposing it to rebuild Europe through the Marshall Plan. Financed, once again, by America's vast economic engine, the psychological toll on Germany was immense. For a people who had once believed in their nation's technical superiority, seeing the limitless reach of U.S. industry was devastating. Many historians later described it as a second defeat, not military, but industrial. It was in these years, as the world rebuilt, that the myth of invincibility shifted westward. The same nation that had been seen as distant and naive before the war was now the planet's industrial and military colossus. American air power, armor, and production had not merely defeated Germany's army. They had redefined the meaning of war itself. And this realization did not end with 1945. It set the stage for everything that followed, from the Cold War arms race to the technological revolutions of the 20th century, because, from the moment Germany's factories went dark and America's assembly lines kept roaring, it was clear the world's balance of power had permanently shifted to those who could build, not just those who could fight. In the months after Germany's surrender, Allied occupation forces began compiling detailed reports on what had truly caused the Reich's defeat. The findings were not centered on tactics or technology, but on capacity. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, published in 1946, stated bluntly, "The war against Germany was won not by superior strategy alone, but by overwhelming industrial superiority." Germany could not match the United States in production, logistics, or endurance. That phrase, overwhelming industrial superiority, would echo in military and political circles for decades. The numbers were irrefutable. While Germany struggled to produce 1,000 aircraft per month at its height, the United States was rolling out 7,000. While the Reich's tank factories were crippled by shortages of steel and oil, America's resource base seemed infinite. And even as Allied bombers flattened German plants, U.S. industry continued uninterrupted, thousands of miles beyond the reach of enemy fire. It was not just about quantity. It was how that quantity was achieved. American engineers had mastered the art of mass production long before the war began. The same techniques that had built cars, radios, and refrigerators now built weapons. Standardized designs, interchangeable parts, and conveyor belt assembly allowed an efficiency Germany never achieved. Albert Speer later admitted this in his memoirs. The American war economy astonished us. It was an economy that could turn from peace to war overnight, without disorder, without panic, only with precision. In contrast, Germany's war economy had been fragmented, competing for resources and burdened by politics. Each branch of the Wehrmacht demanded its own models, its own specifications, wasting precious time and materials. The U.S., by contrast, unified its production under a single purpose. The result was coherence, a national focus that Germany, even under dictatorship, never truly achieved. Post-war reconstruction magnified this divide. While Europe struggled to rebuild its shattered industries, America's remained intact and more advanced than ever. The GI Bill, new housing programs, and a booming export market turned wartime power into peacetime prosperity. Factories that had built bombers now built airliners. Tank plants turned to automobiles. Radar engineers pioneered early computers and communication systems. The Marshall Plan, launched in 1948, became a direct extension of this industrial power. America not only rebuilt Western Europe, but also made it dependent on U.S. goods, machinery, and technology. For Germany, this aid was both a lifeline and a reminder. The same nation that had defeated them through production was now rebuilding them through it. Historians later noted that the war had revealed a new kind of power, one that went beyond armies and borders. It was industrial mobilization as a weapon of global influence. The Soviet Union understood this too. Stalin's response was immediate: to rebuild his own industries and secure resources across Eastern Europe, sparking the arms race that would define the Cold War. But even then, America's manufacturing base remained unmatched. By 1950, the U.S. produced nearly half of the world's manufactured goods. Its GDP was larger than that of Britain, France, Germany, and Japan combined. And the phrase "arsenal of democracy," once a wartime slogan, had become a permanent reality. For Germany's surviving generals and industrialists, the lesson was clear. In post-war interviews and memoirs, many spoke not of battlefield defeats, but of the moment they realized the industrial war was lost. General Heinz Guderian, the father of the Panzer Corps, admitted in 1946, "We lost the war the moment the first American factory began building tanks faster than we could destroy them." This realization shaped Germany's future. When West Germany rebuilt in the 1950s, it adopted the efficiency, standardization, and mass production principles it had once ignored. The nation's post-war economic miracle, the Wirtschaftswunder, was born from studying the very system that had defeated it. The rest of the world followed. From Japan to Europe, every industrial power of the 20th century built its recovery on the American model of wartime production: scale, automation, logistics, and integration. By the time the 1950s dawned, the lesson of World War II was written not in ruins, but in steel and concrete. The nation that controls production controls destiny. Germany's factories had fallen silent, but the hum of American industry continued, a sound that marked not just victory, but the beginning of a new age. And as the 20th century advanced, that sound would echo through every corner of the modern world, from the Cold War to the space race, reminding all who listened of one simple truth: born from the ashes of 1945, power no longer came from conquering land. It came from the power to build. In the quiet years that followed World War II, soldiers returned home, ruins were rebuilt, and the world began to move again. But behind the headlines of victory and peace, one truth endured. The Second World War had been decided not only by courage or tactics, but by production. The battlefields of Europe were littered with the remains of machines. Tanks, planes, trucks, the physical proof of a war waged through industry. Each burned-out Sherman or shattered Panzer told the same story: that the side which could replace its losses faster would outlast the other. Germany's genius had built magnificent weapons. The Tiger tank, the Me-262 jet, the V-2 rocket, but it had built too few. America's strength had not been in perfection, but in repetition. The Sherman tank was not the best in the world, but there were tens of thousands of them. The P-51 Mustang, the B-17 bomber, the Jeep, each became a symbol of a simple truth. Quantity, when driven by purpose and precision, becomes its own form of quality. Factories became the real front lines. Every welder, machinist, and engineer was as vital as a soldier. Every rivet driven into a wing, every tank that rolled from the assembly line was a strike against tyranny. It was war turned into an equation, one that only the United States could solve at that scale. And when the war ended, that industrial power didn't fade. It evolved, fueling decades of innovation, prosperity, and dominance. The same machines that had once built weapons now built the foundations of the modern world. Out of the smoke of total war emerged a lesson that shaped an entire century. That true strength lies not only in the will to fight, but in the capacity to sustain. For the Germans who witnessed it, America's production was more than a military force. It was a revelation. It showed that a democracy, when united, could mobilize with a speed and scale no dictatorship could match. And for history, it left a legacy deeper than any battlefield victory. A reminder that wars may begin with armies, but they are won by nations, by workers, engineers, and the factories that never sleep. In the end, the Allies did not just defeat the Axis, they outbuilt it. And from that truth came the world we live in today, a world shaped by the echo of those engines, the hum of those assembly lines, and the enduring idea that the power to create is the ultimate power to prevail.